Okay, so today we're going to continue with chapter 4 of the Bhagavad Gita. We're in we've been reading it for a couple of times before. And I'm going to start off with chapter 4, text number 6. So here Krishna says, although I am unborn and my transcendental body never deteriorates, and although I am the Lord of all living entities, I still appear in every millennium in my original transcendental form. And I wanted to go back on that one because I felt that this is something that a lot of folks don't get. How is it possible? Because there's no other place where you'll see that it's talked about that God actually comes into this world. They talk of God in the clouds, they talk of God everywhere, but they don't talk of God in this world. Then they take their teachers, people who said specifically that they're not God, and they make them into God. If you read the works of, well, if you read the Bible for that matter, Christ says very clearly how everything, like Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. I stand at the right hand of my Father. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. There's so many references there where he does not call himself. But the only thing they try to say is that because he says, I and the Father are one. Well, oneness means something entirely different. We understand that. Oneness is where you're one in purpose, one in intent, one in as in togetherness. But that's, and then you'll hear, Muhammad talks about being the messenger of God. Guru Nanak speaks of the Sikhs. He talks about being the devotee of God, and you're there as their guru. But Krishna is the only one who claims to be God. He claims to be the Lord of all living entities. He says in the next verse, he says, whenever and wherever there is a decline in dharma, I descend, O Bharat, and there's a decline in religious practice and a predominant rise of irreligion. At that time, I descend myself. So that whenever there's adharma in the world, that is to say, human beings go off track and start behaving in a way that is harmful to themselves, harmful to each other. Whenever there is no more guidance left, no standard of how one should live in this world, he says, then I descend to reestablish the principles of Dharma. So, what I would like you to consider is this: how is it possible for that which is infinite to come into what seems to be a finite form? Because that's the struggle people are having. How can that which is everything, so for those who are spiritualists, they feel God is everything, God is everywhere. How can that which is everywhere be somewhere? That is the question to begin to contemplate. How do you think that would work? Is it even possible? What does your mind tell you? How would you answer someone if they said to you, well, God is everywhere. God can't be a being because the being is too small to contain God.
But if God's everything, then we're all arguably God, just part of the source, like the drop in the ocean. And so in any given time, it could be like, say, when we were talking about the age of enlightenment, it didn't have to be, God doesn't have to come in the form of one person. He can come in the form of a lot of synchronicity moving into the same direction so that people can get recalibrated. But by everything you're saying, seems like we might be having a visit from Krishna soon.
Yes. Actually, the Vedas do predict the coming of the incarnations at different times. Buddha is actually one of them. So there was a time where the Vedas were being highly distorted. And so he incarnates just to sort of wipe the slate clean and just to tell people, okay, let's just stop listening to any of these people who talk about the Vedas and let's just start by being good. Let's just start by leading the right path. Here's the right path, and there's certain things you need to do. and he puts people right back on track. Then from there, they're able to see things differently. So sometimes it's through battle, and sometimes it's through becoming a monk, and sometimes it's like Ram who comes to do his. So there's different times the incarnations of the divine take place, and they are predicted in advance. It's not like somebody can just come up and say, "Oh, I am God, I am Krishna, I'm here, I'm now the one." No, there's a lot of folks who've been doing stuff like that, and it is not so. Um, he's talking very clearly about knowing past, present, and future, knowing when those times will come, uh, and that he's got to be here. So there's a few more questions in here. Um, he talks about his body that never deteriorates. He talks about how he remembers, like he's talking to Arjun. He says earlier on in this very chapter, he says, there are many, many lives both you and I have passed. I can remember all of them, but you cannot. And your point is well taken, Mariah, that um, there are times where there is like a blast of people who are sent to the earth to bring about change, right? They're highly evolved beings, and they come sort of in clusters at times. Um, that may have happened in Europe at some point with the Age of Enlightenment, where you had a bunch of thinkers, who started creating change in the way people were thinking and moving us in the direction we're in right now, science and all of that. And sometimes the change is about just bringing about another angle, another dimension in human consciousness, and see where we go with that. But we also see reformers in spirituality coming about, like Christ and Buddha. Then we have in India, we see Guru Nanak and Mira, we see Chaitanya. They all came around 500 years ago. Um, there was also a time where there were reformers coming out in the Western world. Um, that's where Martin Luther came about, and where you had, so many others came about too. People started up the Mormon Church and what have you. But these experiments have been going on, and to look at where human beings need to evolve and grow. But more important, he's talking about when he himself personally comes. The question is God male or female? And here it sounds like God is male. I want to break that myth as well. Um, Actually, in the Vedic system, you'll see that um, there is never only a male, there is male, female. So it's Ram, Sita, and Ram. And the name of the feminine is always placed in front of the masculine, Radha, Krishna, um, Lakshmi, Vishnu. So the feminine aspect comes along with the masculine aspect. And for those who study more deeply, they get to learn that the feminine aspects of the divine are actually considered more exalted than the masculine. The masculine will usually play the role of the leader. They will usually play the role of the one who is sort of the face or the one in front, but it's the feminine who is there, sort of smoothing things out and making things happen. So Radha, in the case of Radha and Krishna, is the face of compassion, is the face of love, is the face of all the highest qualities that Krishna stands for. Krishna is the one who's the spokesperson out there on the battlefield and doing that whole bit. Krishna is the one who is uh, often told, is often accused of being playful and mischievous and fun-loving, and um, yeah, not everyone can accept or digest what Krishna is, because he can be on one hand non-violent and peace-loving, and on the other hand can stand for violence. He does not take up things according to human logic. He does not follow our predilection for rightness and justice and morality. Not at all. You will find that in the life of Krishna, if you really go and study deeply how, because I started off treating this as a possibility. Okay, so if there is an energy that is a consciousness that creates everything, could it have a form? I said, well, why not? If we can have a form, why can that which created us not have a form? Okay. If it could have a form, does it need to be an old person, or can it be young? It can be young, it can be eternally young if it wants to be. Okay. Does its form have to be the way we are, like physical body, which deteriorates, gets old, and dies? No, not necessary. It could be in any kind of body. Because here Krishna is saying, I have a transcendental body, one that doesn't, and you see through his life, he stays around the age of 16, ever eternally youthful. He never ages. So, is that possible? Yeah, why not? Once you start considering that all things are possible, then this starts to make sense. Does God have to be masculine? No. In this case, he shows he's masculine and feminine. There's a feminine aspect and a masculine aspect. The masculine does its thing, the feminine does its own, acts according to its nature. Okay. What other questions? What questions come up for you? Because he says in the next verse, which is super important, that one who understands this idea never returns to this temporary world. So simply understanding this makes a huge shift in your consciousness. And then why would it be necessary to have a being? Like, to what effect? To what purpose? That's another question. Anyone want to try that one? What do you think? Why would it help for that which is the universe, which is everything, to personify itself? How would that help benefit you and me and all of us? How would it benefit our spiritual path? Who would like to take a shot at that? Mariah?
Is he talking about the we versus the me? That if he's transcendental, that he's really talking about the one consciousness here?
The one consciousness personifying itself and being here amidst us.
So would that be more that the people that connecting into the we versus the me? And
I don't understand your question.
well, you're asking how would it look like if God did that?
Uh-huh.
And I'm
What
saying that
versus
that is that the possibility, and if you understand that, then you don't come back here again. And so I'm just positing that perhaps understanding the nature of that we are all actually a we versus the me, like we're all we're everything. So that
Okay, let me take you one step further, because you're still talking the language of what you've heard so far, which is the language of spirituality that is very common in today's context. There is much more to it than that. What has been taught as spirituality so far in the West is exactly what you're saying right now, that in a sense, we are all God, right? There is, and that collective, you're talking about the collective consciousness as God, that the we, that all of us combined together somehow form something which is God. That's not what the Vedas say.
okay.
That's the reason that I'm even going into teaching this stuff, like the Bhagavad Gita, which I studied like 40 years ago. And I've been living since, but to me, the living it is so much more important than just the study of it. But the reason that I went back in time to bring this up is because I found that in the West, spirituality did not have a real foundation, that people had made and extrapolated things that they wanted to. But here's the problem with that. I feel that if you're going to extrapolate something, if you're going to innovate something, you first need to have your foundation clear. Just for example, if you learn music, you want to first learn music fundamentals, then go out and be a jazz player and innovate. You want to learn the basics of science before you go out and start making new discoveries, right? You want to discover, you don't need to reinvent the wheel, you need to understand what has already been there. So unfortunately, the majority of people in the Western world are reading the modern day writers who are sort of innovating over and above whatever they've learned. But the foundations aren't clear. So that's why I wanted to reestablish those foundations. And what I want to bring to you is this. The Vedas talk about three aspects of the divine, of God. That which is present in everything, Brahman, is present in every atom of the creation. What you're referring to is the second aspect, Param Atma, the presence of God in everyone. Okay? So that collectively, you could call that the collective consciousness or the we as you're referring to. But then it refers to a third aspect, the presence of the divine beyond the physical creation. And that exists firstly as the light, but within the light are beings. Beings, firstly, that are like you and me who have evolved and gone there. But amongst those beings is the supreme being, or God. In other words, the personification of the light, the personification of the totality, right? That personification has all the powers of the totality personified in that being. That being then incarnates from time to time as avatars. Those avatars are the ones we're talking about. Of all those avatars, according to the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is the pinnacle of the Vedas, um, you have Krishna as considered the supreme there. So that's the context. Now we're discussing from a more human, logistical point of view how this all works, right? So we can begin to see, we can get the ideas to fit into our own minds and begin to digest them, right? So what was the question I was asking? How, yeah, what benefit would there be for the everything, right, to personify itself as a being? Would there be any benefit for us?
Yeah, so we can relate to it, understand it at our
Yeah.
level, at the legal, at the ego level, basically.
Yes, yes. So we have something to relate to. Like if you told me you exist, but I could not see a picture of you and I could not talk to you and I could not interact with you in any way whatsoever, except that I know you exist, well, then I'd probably move on to other distractions or other things. But if I met you and I discovered what an incredible being you are, what an incredible mind you have, what a wonderful nature you have, you know, how amazing you are, well, then we might form a friendship. And if we might even fall in love. We might just go all the way. I don't know. But we'd start an interaction, a relationship would begin. And so that's where it starts to make sense that that which is everything, you can't have a relationship with everything. You can't have a connection with everything. And we are wired for connection,
So,
right?
but isn't it a little problematic though, Rohit, that I mean, you're talking about that in the Bhagavad Gita, and yet whenever a supposed God comes to us, it's greeted mostly with skepticism,
Yes.
and you know,
Absolutely.
and then the amount of believers that are saying that are really seeing the true God are very small,
Yes.
and then it's actually expanded upon just by hearsay or not hearsay, but so how is that God really showing himself to people then?
Actually, if you're in a place like India, that's not true. There's just too many believers. And even in the Western world with the Christians and Muslims and all that, there's a lot of believers. The problem is belief. See, they believe in God, but the problem is because they believe, then they can be made to believe all kinds of things. They're not taught from a skeptical point of view. They're not taught from a point of view of questioning things. That's why I prefer to take that approach, is that question everything. Don't believe things. Think for yourself. At some point, you will come to a place of experience for yourself, and then arrive at a conclusion. And that's a more scientific process. Theory, experiment, conclusion, right? Don't believe me. Don't believe even Krishna, but consider the possibility. What if, like the song says, what if God was one of us? So here, of course, the question is, what if God was the personification of all that is, wanting to have a relationship with you, wanting to interact with you? What if that were true? Because that's what he's saying here. Then you consider that possibility. Then you say, all right, let me check out more about who is this? How come this person makes such a claim or such a statement? Then you see, okay, how does that fit together? You take a look at his entire life. Say, okay, is that what God does? Could that be so? Okay, maybe. And then you start to look at the logic behind it. I mean, we are using the only tool we have, which is our limited logic. It is a very limited tool, but we got to start somewhere. So we're using it, right? We could use belief, but then the problem with that is anyone could sell you anything, right? They could just be a really charismatic speaker and they could be like, quote you a bunch of verses and they were like, you know what, if you don't believe that, you're just damned, you're going to hell, blah, blah, blah. You know the story with that one. So how do reasonable and intelligent people figure out God? Do they have to all just say, oh, it's just energy, it's just light, and it can't be anything else? But why can't it be anything else? Why can't God be whatever God wants to be? Would you stop putting God in a box? That's been my sort of thing. I love the idea that we can have a relationship, a connection, because that's what we like as human beings. That's what we long for, right? Why wouldn't we want that with God? And if we could have a connection, now how would that work? I'm hearing a lot of silence. I'd love to hear some more questions.
I got a question on that one there. I'm kind of wrapping my head around that idea. Because a relationship with God, as far as I see it at this point,
Mhm.
is really in the subtle levels,
Oh,
like
yeah.
the very subtle energetic levels is where I feel like I'm just growing a deep relationship with God.
Yes.
However, to almost the point you were saying before, where it sounded like a light being coming in and embodying like flesh and bone and sitting here right in front of me, that's something I haven't really spent much time with. Um, and I don't know, it's like maybe it's because I only hear this in stories, and somehow I've come to the idea that I believe that these stories, how we talk about the Bhagavad Gita, isn't, there's some philosophies say this is all metaphorical, while some is just like, no, these are real events that did take place. So I understand that idea, but I have another. So what I'm thinking is, if a divine being comes down, it's really reserved for highly, highly evolved
Okay.
beings who could understand and handle that I'm face to face speaking with an incarnation of God himself, herself.
Actually, you are so right about that, and you're nailing it all the way, because he says here that, and he goes on to, I'm not sure if it's here or later, that he says that very few people understand this. Very few people understand him as he is. He says thousands, millions actually seek God. Out of those millions, very few actually learn, really experience God. And out of those who experience God, very few really know him as he is. You're absolutely right on with that. We're not talking of a transcendent being in flesh and blood. What he's claiming here is that he does not take on, he appears before us, but does not take on a flesh and blood and bone body. He comes in a transcendent form. Therefore, that form never ages. I mean, he goes from childhood to 16, and then from there on, he continues in that form. So, is the writing of all these incredible wise people. Now, if you look at the Vedas, there's incredible amount of wisdom and philosophy and spiritual teaching in there. Are these incredibly wise people referring to these so-called incarnations? And I'm still taking a skeptic's point of view here. Are these incredibly wise people referring to these beings as real? Because they refer to them as real. They don't refer to them as metaphorical. They refer to them as real, as the philosophy that they're speaking. and some of the most incredible philosophies here in the Vedas. If it's considered with an open mind, it's just it's mind blowing. The processes, the meditations, all of that. So, are these beings who write these texts and refer to those avatars, as in Krishna, as in Ram, as in Buddha, and so on, are they talking about something metaphorical or real? Now, the problem is we've had thousands of years between that time and this time. Western historians do not record what happened then. They did not exist to record that. We're left with these narrations, and in fact they were actually narrations. They were they were in fact spoken from one generation to another. They actually created a language in which the meter and the rhyme and everything was so perfect that you could not distort or adulterate the verses. They had to follow a certain sort of code, and till today that has been coming down. Then 5,000 years ago it was all written down, but thousands of years before that it existed. Then 5,000 years ago, they actually write it down. And then that written text comes, it's being interpreted by lots of people, but the text remains the same, no matter whose translation you're reading in modern time, that is. So those beings, those highly evolved writers at that time, refer to Krishna as Bhagavan, means the cause of all causes, the supreme being, right? So I'm not asking that you believe them. I'm saying consider the possibility. What if? And what would be the advantage of that? And why would that be meaningful to you? See, if you're going to have a relationship with someone, you need to know something about them. The more you know about them, the deeper your fascination becomes. The more you become curious, the more you want to, oh, wow, what would this person be like? What would they do? How do they look? What is their, what's their life all about? Then you begin to form a bond. That bond, that relationship now takes you deeper into understanding them. Now, when you are having a question, when you have a dilemma in your life, you have this being you can turn to. But now it's not just an abstraction. It's not just an abstract being. It's not just someone, who's in a book, and it's not just someone but you've actually started to experience this being. And as far as I'm concerned, you don't experience this being in isolation. You experience this being through everything, through all those three different aspects that we talked about earlier, through nature, but in interaction with other human beings, as well as in your meditations where you experience the light, you experience this different energy in you and all around you. You begin to understand that all of these exist simultaneously. The impersonal and the personal exist simultaneously. That God is a being and yet an energy that is everywhere, simultaneously. It's not an either or, it's a both and more. So while Krishna is speaking here about how he comes to deliver the pious and to annihilate the miscreants, that's the next verse, and to reestablish the principles of Dharma, that's exactly what he does. Right from his childhood, there's all kinds of, it's a fascinating story if you read the Krishna book. It's available on Amazon and you can get it. There are even movies that have been made, but they're really badly made. They don't have anything that's well made. I hate to recommend them. But the Krishna book has its KRSNA. It's spelled that way, KRSNA, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So there you read his story, you read his life stories, especially the early years, and actually the entire thing. And you begin to understand how and what this being is. Personally, in my own experience, I haven't come across something that actually made sense as much as this does, right? Or anyone that even firstly, I never came across anyone that claimed to be God outside of some um, actual charlatans who were like gurus, but gurus who claimed to be God. You had strange, I don't know if I should get into their names there, but some who claimed to be God, but said there is no God. There's no being like God, but I am God. They'd say, I don't believe there's anything like God. But then they called themselves God. They called themselves Bhagavan, whatever. Um, there were others who said everyone is God, but I'm actually God. Uh, there's no logic behind this stuff. So this is the first place I find that it actually makes sense. And not only is it being claimed by Krishna, Arjuna actually challenges him in the text. But not only is it in this text, the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna is talking, in all the other texts where Krishna is not talking, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, the Vedas, the same claims are made by sages and rishis for thousands of years before he even comes. So that's the context. And if one takes the time to read further, you'll actually get that context. You'll understand why this makes sense.
I have a question because this it's a lot for me to absorb, with just a few. I mean, I've been to maybe 5 or 6 of these meetings, and
Right.
it's dense. I mean, there's a reason why it's taught by somebody else who's read it and practiced it. But so the people who compiled this conversation
Right.
and wrote it, they received this information some in meditation, or is that?
So the conversation between Krishna and Arjuna is actually occurring on a battlefield. There is no one sitting there writing it down. What is happening is, and this is how the book actually begins, is there is a king who was the king of the land at that time, Dhritarashtra, and there is his, I don't know, attendant, manservant, or whatever he is, Sanjaya. Sanjaya has, before the battlefield, there's a story about how he is gifted with the ability to remotely view everything that is going to happen in the battle and convey it to the king. The king is blind and cannot see. The king is not capable of going on the battlefield. So Sanjaya would be his eyes and ears and would see everything that is happening and relate it. That's what's actually going on. Now, the whole conversation at that point is also being heard and seen by Vyas. Vyas is the one who actually does the writing. Vyas is simultaneously hearing that and writing it down. He also compiles the rest of the Vedas, Vyas did. Along with Ganesh, he writes down all of the Vedas, which runs into thousands of books, of which I've read maybe 20, 30. The ones that are supposedly the pinnacle, the Srimad Bhagavatam. And that is just a whole other set of fascinating philosophy and stories. And they talk of times and of beings that were far more evolved than what we see here today. Here we're very evolved because of our science, but what is evolved in our present time is the external. Our machines have evolved, our technology has evolved. But then, at that time, thousands of years ago, they were focused on evolving the being, the person. And they evolved. See, there's the difference. They developed inner technologies, whereas we've developed outer technologies. So the result of that resulted in a very high grade of human beings. However, and here's the problem, when you develop yourself to a high level, so does your ego. There is a great risk to be had over here that occurs. And that civilization caused its own destruction due to
Yeah,
that.
I've seen a lot of images, even growing up, like when I was like in high school, I would
Mhm.
see drawings, like cartoons of people with, the bigger their brain got, the more depressed they got, or the sadder that they got. And
Right.
it's, and I kind of felt that way too. Like I started to understand that that saying ignorance is bliss. It's like I almost wish I didn't know all this stuff because
Yeah,
it weighs you down. But
yeah,
it's all external things, all things that you're taught, all things that you're expected to do, the
yeah.
reality of the world, and so what's going on in 4-9 is he's saying that one who knows this nature.
Yes.
So knowing is one thing, but then also dharma, so practicing as well.
Practicing as well. In fact, he makes it clear later that it's not enough to just intellectually know it. One has to know it as in a knowing, like you know it in your bones, you feel it, you experience it, you're like, you get it.
When you know and you practice
Yeah,
this nature, this transcendental nature, beyond the body nature,
right.
you are liberated from
Yes.
that
When you get to
material.
understand God as He is, you see, here's the thing. Just like we don't want to be uh, known only for our job,
Yeah.
God is the job of this being. And so most people have a very formal relation. Those who consider God as a being, right? It starts off with a very formal relationship. So people see God as great and we are small. That's the formal relationship. And you'll find that that's where people will go and they will bow down to God and they will not want to disobey the word of God and they will want to be very obedient and they will want to be very faithful. And there's all of this stuff, right? Because they think God is small. We are, God is great. We are small and we need to be afraid of God. We need to fear God. God is the king, right? So they think of God as this king. That's the formal relationship. In the Vedas, it exists. In the Bible, it exists. In the Quran, it exists. It exists everywhere. Wherever they've tried to conceive of God as a being, that formal relationship exists. But those who begin to truly understand God, they take away the aspect that this is God. They want to now get to know, who are you at home? I want to get to know you intimately. I want to know you like I know myself. I want to have a relationship with you. At that point, because that is the point of Krishna. Krishna is that one place where you no longer see him. You no longer see God as God. You see him as a being, as a playful, fun-loving. That whole period of his life, especially his childhood, is where you get to see that. You now know that this is an option you have. You no longer need to have that formal relationship. You can relate to God the way you relate to a friend, as a buddy. During his childhood, you see his friends climbing on his shoulders, stealing his lunch, right? Doing the things that kids do. You see his mom chasing him with a stick to beat him, tying him up because he's been so naughty, right? He's been taking all, they're a dairy community. They sit with their hands, they don't have machines. They're with their hands, they're churning the butter. And then this little kid comes along and feeds butter to all his friends and to the monkeys, and breaks the pots and does stuff like that. And they're like, what the hell? So they're angry, but at the same time, he's so cute and he's so adorable. And so they're like, I, they're so taken in, they're so infatuated and in love with him, but at the same time, he's so maddening. They don't know quite how to do it. The girls of the village, they're going off to the river to get water because water had to be got in pots and brought home. So they have these clay pots that they carry on their head, and they're going to the river to get the water. And they've got the water and they're coming back home, and he meets them on the way and says, you got to pay the tax. What's the tax? The tax is a kiss. And they're like, no, we're not going to do that. So the next thing, he's got his slingshot out and he breaks the pot. The Leela, the pastimes of Krishna are so charming and beautiful that you think, is this what it's like to be with God? It's like, it's like fun and games. It's like this playfulness. It's this silliness. It's this, yeah, yeah. It's not about some formal relationship. It's about an informal relationship. It's about an intimate relationship. So that's why I encourage you to read more about that. Because you can be at the level of the philosophy, that's still this knowledge, but then expand that. What does that possibility look like? What does it look like to have that kind of relationship with God? Yeah, great.
Yeah, question on just that idea of holding Krishna to that value, and just how I'm not totally familiar. Say like you take India for example, what you were just saying, how you go over to India and everyone's so devout and all.
Mhm.
This idea of Krishna, I think of say like the Hare Krishnas here. I'm mixing Western with India, so I really don't know this, but I feel that there's some who really aspire to Krishna, but then I also understand there's Shivites, right? And then
Yes.
they have Shiva. So is that but and so this is where different ideas may come into place, but I do know like Shivites who take the Bhagavad Gita to heart as far as like this is teaching all four bhakti, yoga, gyan, like the whole bit.
Right.
When Hare Krishna seem to be like hugely bhakti. Um,
Yes.
yeah, so I don't know, it's like India as a whole, or like Shivites are over here. Are they using different tools and methods other than this like idea of Krishna, or what do you usually
Yes.
come across? What do you find?
Yes, they are. No, this is very true. Um, Basically, there are two schools of thought when you look at India, and if you can break it down, there are those who, there is one school called Advaita. Advaita means they follow the principle of non-duality, okay? That everything is one. That is the principle of oneness that has been taught in the West. This is what is most popular right now. Earlier, yes, you're right, there were the Hare Krishnas, they talked about Krishna as well. But they talked about Krishna in a very, I don't know, I did study a lot of that. I was a monk even with them for some time, but I broke away from all of that because I found their understanding limited, in my opinion. They had a lot of truth there. However, let me start from the beginning. So there are these two groups, the Shivites, the non-dualists, the Buddhists, they all come into one category. The idea that they embrace God only as an energy, not as a being. Okay? Amongst the Shivites, they worship Shiva. So that's a being. So why they're into the concept of non-duality, then if you ask who is Shiva, there is one particular tiny part of the Vedas called the Shiva Puran, talks about Shiva as the supreme being. However, it is only in that one tiny part. It is nowhere else. Everywhere else in the thousands of books of the Vedas, it is Vishnu, and then from Vishnu, Krishna, who is referred to as the supreme being. Okay? But outside of beings, let's come back to our conversation here. Non-duality or energy is what a large segment of people believe in. And there's a larger segment of people that believe in God as a being. Okay? And then there's a huge segment in between that are not interested in either of these two, that just believe in different demigods because they just want to have their material desires fulfilled. That's the larger population. Just like you have Catholics, and Catholics believe in saints, they believe in saints not for any other reason other than they feel the saints will be a shortcut to getting their material desires fulfilled. If my understanding is incorrect, please let me know, but that's how I've come to understand it. It's the same way in Hinduism, you find people worshiping different demigods like Ganesh, like Durga, and so on and so forth, who will give them their material desires. They're not really interested in God. They're only interested in what can I get and what's the shortcut. I put in $1 here, I get $1 million over there. Lottery ticket, right? They're interested in that idea. Um, how many of them get it? It's just like a lottery ticket. There's a few people who get it, who win the lottery, and now everybody's clamoring for that. But you see all the people who worship these different demigods, most of them are very poor. They're not rich, but that's what they're aspiring for. Then the non-dualists that you're talking about, Craig, they're very well studied and have read the Vedanta. They have read these texts. And from that, they've come to the conclusion of God as an energy. Then there are the people who do bhakti. Again, bhakti group is not huge in comparison. Okay? Very select people who actually have that understanding of what Krishna is and why he is significant. He's not there fulfilling anyone's material desires. He's not there, trying to kind of make sure your son gets a job, or make sure your daughter gets a good husband, or make sure that that you're able to amass a lot of wealth. Not ready to do that. So these two groups have that I'm talking about, the non-dualists and those who think that God is a being. They have been always at odds with each other, with their philosophies, saying, no, my philosophy is better, my philosophy is better. Until around 500 years ago, where you see the advent of reformers like Chaitanya, Mira, Nanak, and they're saying, guys, cut it out. Both things are true simultaneously. In fact, refer to the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 12. Krishna says, both paths lead to me. It doesn't matter whether you're a yogi who practices the impersonal understanding and you think God is the universe and energy, or you believe that God is a being. Both paths lead to the same destination. The difference, he says, is in chapter 12 of the Bhagavad Gita, he says that on the path of devotion, you get help. You have a relationship with God. And so now there's a path of surrender. So you get a lot of help there. It makes it easier. But hey, you can do whatever you like. You have total freedom. No one is forced to do anything. You can do nothing if you like. You can go out and worship some demigods if you like and see if that works for you. You can come and say God is impersonal, see how that works for you. Or you can try coming to God as a being, see how that works. No one here is going to be punished. No one is going to be sent to hell. There will be consequences for whatever you do, but you'll get to see and learn according to the way. So please don't get caught up in the idea it's one versus the other. Truly speaking, I borrow from all different schools. I learned from Buddhists, I learned from Vedantists, I learned from those who think that God is the impersonal, and from those who talk of God as being a being. I take from all of them because I feel each of them has something to offer me. I learned from the Christians, I learned from the Muslims, I learned from the Buddhists. That's been my path. What would you like to do?
That's great. Thank you. That's clears up a lot. Super helpful.
Good, thanks.
I would like to do the same thing you're doing. I'm interested in the whole bit. It's all helpful. Everything I hear is just like, it's exciting. It all just like revs me up to go down the path.
Yeah. So try out, considering, since Craig, you've been on the side that is more about the non-dual, the Advaita, but you've stuck it out with our group out here. Consider what it might be like to have a relationship with God. And then also consider what, like that's one of the reasons I don't like to ascribe to any particular group, like whether it's the Hare Krishnas or the Hinduism or this or that. I don't call myself a Hindu. I don't call myself a Hare Krishna. I don't call myself a Christian or any of those things, right? I feel that we can have a direct relationship with God. We don't need these different sects and different cults and groups and religions. We can have a direct relationship. And that has been the path of the mystics from time immemorial. And I don't say, I want you to follow me. I don't want you to follow me. I want you to follow you. I want you to follow your heart, your calling, and find what works for you. Ultimately, I found that to be the best way to go forward, because that's what I discovered worked for me. Not depending on anyone. You can learn from someone, that's good. I did, right? But ultimately, I had to strike out and stand on my own. You got to drop the crutches and stand on your own. And that's when you have that direct connection with the divine. If you look at anyone who really stood out in the spiritual arena, you will see that they broke away from everything and stood on their own. They had to form their own connection first, and then they spoke from their own personal learning. Now, the problem is everybody gathered around them and followed that one person and didn't listen to anybody else, like to the exclusion of everything else. And that's one thing I found to be a huge mistake. Don't be a follower of either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or any party, right? Don't be a follower of anything or anyone. Keep your mind open, learn from everywhere. And then eventually stop the learning and have the experience directly. And then you'll go be, and then the learning starts to now become organic. It comes from within you. Yeah, right.
So when you had started this conversation, you had read a verse that something like, mankind gets off the path, and I come down every millennium or every, and to correct. And then what I thought you asked was, in a transcendental form, and what I thought you asked was, what does that look like?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of curious, if you don't mind me going back to that, because I'm listening to everything that you're saying, and because you're saying personal relationship with God, he comes back every millennium. But what does that look like? If so, I posited that maybe it's just like movements that happen, but what does it look like to you, so that to have that personal relationship?
What does it look like to have that personal relationship?
No. What does that look like when he's coming in a transcendental form? What does that look like? It's not. So you said it wasn't a person.
Yeah.
Not a movement. What is it?
Look, the only thing you've got, I have not seen with my own eyes what God looks like. Okay. Till the point I do, I'll defer to those who have. Right. For me, that is whatever they've tried to depict Krishna as being. So what does that look like? Well, I could show you the pictures of Krishna, and that might make something sense for you or not. We'll have to see.
So
But
there's not really an answer to the question then.
No, there is. That is the answer. That I accept the forms that others have seen or that are described in the Vedas, and then comes a point or a stage where you have your own experience, and then you can speak from that. And since I don't have a direct experience of seeing with my eyes,
Okay.
I do have the experience of hearing that voice. Yes, I've written hundreds of pages listening to that voice, asking the questions that I had, and writing down the answers that I received. So yes, I have that experience, writing information that I had never heard before, never come across before, that was not out of any book that I had ever read. That experience I've had. To me, that experience was a conversation with God. And that went on for over about 15 years. That is what kind of changed me from the inside out, as far as evolving, growing, whatever. But seeing, no, that's not been my experience. So I'm very clear with that. What I have to then rely on is what others may have seen or what has been described, till such point as I can have my own experience. But Krishna does reveal himself to many people along the way. There have been many who have had that experience. Right? Are we at the... Yep, we need to transition. Thank you. Thank you all for really taking part and being in your questions and really, driving it home. Appreciate that. It is a tough topic to understand because we've had so many different people who've come forward and presented themselves as God, but without the things to back it up. Here, when Krishna is speaking, there's an entire philosophy he's teaching. There's an entire path he's talking about. And he's willing to stand by what he's, if you read later, you go into chapter, I think it is 10, 11, where he shows the universal form. That chapter, he's really being challenged by Arjun, saying, hey, how do I know what you're saying is true? How do I know that you are the supreme being? You're claiming it again and again and again. Like Krishna doesn't stop claiming that, where he says he's the source of all material and spiritual worlds. So people talk about source in today's time in the modern day spirituality, but who is that source? Who or what is that source? Krishna claims to be the source. In chapter 10, text number 8, he says, I am the source of all spiritual and material worlds. Everything emanates from me. The wise who perfectly know this engage in serving me with love and devotion and worship me with their heart. So he goes on like that, and then Arjun's like, okay, I need to know. Chapter 11 is where Arjun actually says, I would like to see that, I've heard there is this particular form of yours, which is like this universal form. So then he shows Arjun that form. And in that form, he shows him all the universes and all the planets. He shows him time, past, present, and future. He shows him how everything is contained within that form. That form apparently is very gigantic, like it says, from the earth to the sky. So then Arjun gets very terrified. He's like, oh my God, this is too overwhelming. It's too much data to take in. As Andrea, I think it was Andrea, someone was pointing out, there's too much information to test. Sometimes it feels like too much information. But yeah, that's how Arjun feels at that time. He says, can you please come back the way you were? You were really, I like seeing you the way you were. Could you come back to that as my friend? And so I can kind of continue to have that relationship with you. I can't relate to this huge giant form that has all these, planets and universes and everything's inside that being. Can't relate to that. So those are the different stages the Gita goes through. And yeah, if you like to go to read fast. I did a whole reading of the entire Gita from beginning to end over the last 12, 13 days after my dad's passing. And I put that up on Facebook, on my private personal page. So you prefer to read it there, or you prefer to listen to it there, or you prefer to read it directly yourself. Either way is good. Any last questions before we wind up?
See you in a minute.
All right, see you in a minute. We'll be right back, loving soulfully, in just a minute.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
We'll be back real soon.
Thank you, sir.